So the last video I was doing a landscape, and so I started by painting directly on the canvas, but I'm doing a cheetah, and a cheetah, here's the picture I'm working from. Normally I like to work from photos that I took myself, but unfortunately a trip to Africa was not in my budget. But fortunately, a friend of mine had spent 2 years in Africa helping rehabilitate cheetahs, and she gave me some photos that she took and gave me permission to paint them. So I love that. Now remember, if as a student you can probably borrow some pictures off the internet and paint them, but the photograph has a copyright as well as a painting does. And so you're allowed as a student to copy photographs and use them to learn from, and you can give those pictures away or hang them in your own home, but you're not allowed to sell them. And so make sure you have permission from the photographer to paint their picture if you didn't take the picture yourself. Otherwise there's a copyright infringement, and if you try to make money off that image you could be in trouble. So most of my paintings are done from my own photographs that I took, and quite often I just paint right there on location, but I didn't have that opportunity with this one. And so because it's an animal, or any portrait of an animal or a person, I'd like to do a preliminary drawing. Drawing is very important in painting, and especially in portraiture and animals, because they're very precise. And in miniatures, it's doubly important because there is no room for error. Every little tiny mistake is a big mistake. So what I did was I took this picture here and I cropped it to just include the one cheetah, because his little mouth was wide open and somebody else might want to paint him. That's fine, but I decided I'm just going to paint this one. And I did a sketch on how it was going to be the same size as my canvas. This is a transfer paper, and what it is, in the olden days they had something they called carbon paper, which was ink on paper, and you used it to transfer type. Well, this is kind of like that, only it's graphite, like pencil, and it's used to transfer. If you press down on it, it leaves a mark. So this is the way I can trace my drawing on the canvas, and I don't have to redraw it, and I don't leave my canvas really messy. If you just drew on the canvas, you're going to do a lot of erasing. It's just easier to do it in your sketchbook first and then transfer it. So I've cut out my little sketch and I've attached it to the back of my canvas so that I can peek. I want to be able to come back to the same position in case I'm not sure if I'm finished yet. Then I make sure that I'm using the dark side of the graphite paper and put that between. A lot of times I have smaller pieces, but for now I just have this big one. And I want to take a very hard, firm pencil or a stylus. It doesn't have to actually draw, but I'm going to trace my cheetah. It will transfer wherever I trace. I try to keep it as close to the drawing as possible. It doesn't always come out perfect, and so I figure if I drew it once, I can draw it again. But this gets me pretty close to what I need. And I don't have to draw all the spots on the cheetah at this point. I just need to get the general idea of where he is. I didn't even have to draw it in my preliminary sketch, but just for demonstration purposes I went ahead and put in some of his spots. But I think the brush is much finer than the pencil, and it will be easier to do those details with the brush. And so I think we're ready to start on the painting. Today I am painting on a masonite, which has been planed to a little thinner than what you can get in the store, and it's been sanded or gessoed and then sanded. So the last time I did this, I used the water mixable oil paints, the Winsor Newton water mixable, and this time I'm actually going to be using regular oils. And the difference between the regular oils and the water mixable is the regular oils, you need a solvent to clean your brushes. And in this jar I have turpenoid, and I buy it by the gallon. So this is an odorless turpentine, and the real stuff, the real odor, the regular turpentine just smells really bad and it gives a lot of people a headache. This one has no odor, and most people would not even know I'm painting with turpentine. There is another kind of turpentine called the natural turpenoid, and I really don't like that particular brand. It doesn't clean your brushes very well. It's supposed to be less toxic, but just don't eat your turpentine and you'll be fine. I always like to have every color of my palette on my palette. Even if I'm only doing a little bit of one of the colors, you never know when I'm going to need that other color, so I like to have it available. And with oils, I don't have to worry about them drying out. I might do it differently if I were doing acrylic paint or watercolor. I guess watercolor doesn't matter, but acrylic paint dries so fast that maybe you wouldn't want to put every color out because you'd be wasting a lot of paint. But with oil, I can have the luxury of having my paints available at all times. Okay, so that was cadmium. It says Hansa Yellow Deep, but usually I use the cadmium medium, which is a little warmer. This is a yellow ochre. Alizarin Crimson is the cool red. And that's the cadmium red medium. It's a little orangier than the alizarin crimson. Now the blues. Actually, I'll just go ahead and put the purple next because it's between. Now, this is actually a cobalt violet. And previously I used a dioxin violet, but somehow I'm not finding it. I found the cobalt, so I'll use that. And I'm going to put on the ultramarine blue next. Prussian blue last. And I've put these up with a little bit of poster putty, so that keeps it on the board. And I'm going to switch to my glasses, my magnifiers that clip onto my glasses, and my close-up lenses. And I may not need my magnifiers right away, but I will need them, so I will bring them down when I need them. And I also have a medium, but the medium is actually the same medium I used before, and it is a water mixable medium, and I didn't have the proper jar last video, but this is the actual jar. And I just discovered using this that I like it, using it with or without traditional oil paint. It has a really nice consistency, and I keep it in another jar to not contaminate the fresh clean jar here. So one of my favorite very fine brushes is the Princeton art brush, and this is a 20-aught liner. And so when I get down to the nitty-gritty of doing eyes, nose, and mouth and such, I'm going to need this for sure. But to start off, I will probably use the bigger filberts. This one is a number 2 in the Princeton family. and even a bigger filbert for the background. And this one says it's a number 4, and it's also a Princeton. It's a select. So I seem to like Princeton a lot because they do have a nice variety of sizes. And we're going to start the painting using my favorite kind of purple gray color. So I have to mix that color. And I will start with a monochromatic kind of black and white, or purple and white as you might say, study until I can figure out all my darks and light before I actually go in with the actual color that the final painting will be. This will help me figure out my composition and how the black and the white are going to work. Since I am changing it a little from the photograph because I want him to stand out, this part will actually help me decide exactly how I'm going to do that. I'm going to start out with my pretty cobalt violet. And I'm going to add some yellow ochre to it, being a complementary color, and probably a little bit of white. It doesn't have to be any specific color because it's going to probably not even show through on the final painting, but it is kind of like my preliminary drawing. So it doesn't actually have to go with this, but it will blend very nicely. Alright, so let's start by blocking in our biggest areas that need to be blocked in. And I like to get my brush a little wet before I put it into the oil paint, and that way it gets deep into that oil paint. This is the part that a lot of my students are scared of, you know, just that first brush stroke of where we're going to put everything. So I'm going to put it right next to his head and start getting his profile. And because of this board, it's very, very smooth. You can see the brush strokes really well. Now remember, this is just your first layer, and if it's not perfect, that's okay. It will, you know, every layer is a chance to get it more perfect. And I don't like to have my brush strokes going in one specific direction. Getting them in random directions helps it look more natural. If everything was going in one direction, I kind of do more of a crisscross back and forth feel to it. But I will also just be softening up that a lot pretty soon. And using as big a brush as you can helps it go by much quicker. If I tried to do this entire painting with that 20-aught liner, it would take twice as long, and you know, you can go quickly sometimes with some of these. I don't paint as fast as some people do, but so if you find that you don't like a spot, for instance, I went over him right there. I took a clean wet brush and used it like an eraser. Okay, so that background is okay. I do want to soften it up, and I can do that with my fan brush. So if you want to blend or soften things up, you can use a soft brush like this, or a fan brush is actually meant to blend, and so you might want to just go over it gently, just touch the very top of it. It has to be a very dry brush for this to work. You see how it just kind of dissolves those brush strokes and makes it kind of blurry and puts them in the background. Now, and that just gives a kind of distance feel to it. And of course, most of this may be actually lost in the final picture, but that just made me feel better, so I did it like that. Alright, let's work on the animal. I'm not going to worry about any spots at this point. I'm just kind of putting in the basics, lights and darks. He's got a little bit of color on his face, and you want to be careful enough not to blow it terribly, but this is just kind of getting an idea where everything is. And I don't have a lot of paint on my brush. It's rather thin, and so when I do put the next layer on, the rule is fat over lean. This is lean. I do my first layers fairly thin. And the reason for the fat over lean in the full-size paintings, usually a miniature doesn't ever get that fat, which means it doesn't get oily. But if you did paint a thin layer over a thick layer, the thin layer would dry quicker and would cause cracking in your painting, and you don't want to do that. I'm putting my original sketch up here because that will give me an idea of what I don't want to make it too much like the photograph, and I tend to do that, and I think you want to make sure that you're not a slave to your photo. You don't have to do it exactly like the photograph. You can improve. And these and the original picture had some really nice distance, like trees and things. And I kind of wanted to give that impression of distance, but you can't see that in these photos. So using my clean wet brush, I can use that as an eraser to give just a little bit of skyline above here. Maybe get an idea. I can lift some of that paint off. So I'm going to lighten up this area a bit. Have a gradual change from there. So once again, I'm going to grab that fan brush and just soften up that background. Because I want it just to be kind of out of focus. And again, it's not going to be the same color, but it'll give me an idea of composition. Oh, good. I like that better. So that's pretty much the first layer. There's not a lot of detail. It's just getting an idea of where everything is. You could probably spend a whole lot of time on every little detail if you wanted to and do a complete black and white rendering. And I've done that before. But chances are you're going to cover it up and lose it if you're not careful. So you might as well just start in with the actual colors that you're going to use. And I think I am ready for that. I'm going to use the Prussian blue in just a tiny bit. I don't need a whole lot, just a little bit. And if I can always add more. You see how it's not that blue. I'm going to have a couple of versions of that so that I don't have just a blue sky. I want it to be a variety of colors in the sky, not just blue, or not just one blue. Okay, so that one's just a little bit darker, and maybe a little tiny bit of that pink that I like to put in my skies. Having a touch of pink or a touch of yellow in the sky gives it a little bit of depth and feeling as opposed to just a plain blue sky. Since it's just a tiny, like, strip, it don't need much. So I've got the lighter blue now, and I'm going to use that as my base. And I said that I don't like to have a directional brush strokes, but the sky and sometimes water is kind of the exception. You want it to be horizontal, you don't want it to be vertical unless there's a storm going on or something. Now that's all solid color. I'm going to add a touch of this other blue so that it's not all just one blue. And then this very, very pale pink, I'm going to put a little bit of that in there. And at this point, it's very rough, and I'm just going to soften it up with this flat, soft brush. Kind of like a fan brush, only it's in a smaller version. And blend those together. So in this picture, there are distant trees, and they look almost like a blue color. I'm gonna start with some of this sky color I just made, this blue, and make it a little bluer with that same Prussian blue. But I want it darker, but I don't want it as brilliant as this blue is. So I'm gonna tone it down, as being this brilliant will make it just pop right forward. And it looks to me like it might have a little bit of red in there. I'm being drawn to my undercover color, which is this kind of almost a yellow ochre color. It's the purple. I'm going to mix this brownish purple into that blue. Anytime you add a warm color to a blue, you're going to dull it down a little. I'm going to add a little bit of alizarin crimson to it. Maybe too much. Let's see. No, I like that. So you can see that this is some of those colors in the distance. And I don't have to paint specific trees, but kind of give an impression that there's something back there, this, you know, in the distance. I'm going to keep it soft and blurry, and it's okay if some of the underpainting shows through a bit. You don't want it too dark, so if it starts getting kind of dark, you can lighten it up with a little bit of white. Now there's a rule about things touching your main interest. So I want, if I'm going to have a color come up to his head, I don't want it just to come to the top of his head and stop. I want it to come down a little bit lower, or I want it to be above his head. I don't want it just touching, and that's called a tangent. It won't get the feeling of depth. You want it to overlap so that it is going to give that illusion of distance. Before I soften that up even more, I'm going to add a couple other colors. I see some like pinky, lighter colors in here, so I took a little bit of the pink I made for the sky and a little bit of that purple and yellow ochre mixture, and I'm starting. Now, a lot of times I'm not sure if this is going to be where I'm going, so I just keep adjusting. I need a little bit more alizarin crimson in there and a little more yellow ochre in there. Almost too warm. I like that color for some of the other areas, but it's not where I'm going yet, so I'm going to save some of that color for later. I think adding a little bit of this purple blue color that I was just using will help dull that down a bit and send it into the background. Sorry about that, I was covering it up. So I used a little bit of this to dull that down, but it still maybe needs a little bit of the cadmium red. Let's see, I'm aiming at a specific tone, and why don't I add some of that cobalt purple to it? See how I keep playing with it until I just get it just right. So half of the picture is just getting the color exactly right. Now it doesn't have to be exactly the same color that I mixed. The value is really more important than the color is, but you also don't want to make a really bright color in the distance. Just add a little more purple to that. Let's see. Now we're talking. I think that's closer. What I was seeing was kind of this tree in the distance had this kind of a tree shape, had that color, and a little bit of that blue. And I'm adjusting colors as I go. I want something here to be just a little bit lighter, a little bit pinker. So I'm playing with that a little on my palette and then putting that up there. And you're keeping it out of focus and just get the impression that there's some distant trees going on and an idea of his environment. And at this point I can kind of soften it up with that dry brush again, this dry brush. And this is a nice technique too. Now I can actually see like the little trunks and things, but I'm going to do this first and then add the trunks. So what this is just a very soft and dry brush, and I'm just barely touching it and blending it into the wet paint below it. And if that isn't what you want, you can always go back and add some more paint to it. For instance, if I lost some of that sky in there and I wanted to bring it back, I can just go back in and give it a little bit of texture. And sometimes you do want a little more color than the picture says, as long as it's not distracting from the subject. You can have some pretty brilliant colors as long as the subject isn't overpowered and the subject includes some of those brilliant powers. So that's kind of nice, those distant fuzzy trees. And I will add just a hint that there are trunks on those trees, and that'll really tell everybody those are trees. But you don't want them too dark. Probably the same dark blue that I was using. And I get out my liner and make a couple of trunks. Always make your trunks larger at the base and thinner at the top. I just love doing trees because you can pretty much screw up a tree and it still looks like a tree. So now some of this brush in the background would be nice to have the right kind of brush for that. I have to block it in first. This filbert is a little old. It does not have exactly the point that some filberts do, and that's good. I don't need it to have a real sharp point when I'm doing this kind of texture. I want it to be kind of mushy and open. For the dark color, I don't want to take all that blue in case I decide I like it for something else. I'm going to take a little bit of that blue. I'm going to make it a little darker by adding a little more blue and a little more red. And I'm going to add some of the cadmium red to it, and that will hopefully make it more brown. I added a little too much, so I add more blue. There we go. Cadmium red and blue make some gorgeous browns. And I'm also going to make a color that's even darker than that, using more of my blue and a little bit of that cadmium red again. So this one I want to be a little darker, so I'm going to keep adding a little blue to it till it's where I want. So I have kind of a dark brown and then an almost black. Now I may not use this black right away, but I want it there just in case I decide I want it. I need it. So those are the two dark colors for some of that brush behind the cat. And I'm going to make these lighter golden colors. So I'm going to start with white. Put it over here. And add a little bit of yellow ochre to that. That always makes a very pretty off-white pale gold color. So I like that. I'm going to keep that, but I'm also going to make a slightly darker color using those same yellow ochre and white, but I'm going to also add a little bit of the cadmium yellow medium to it, and that'll give it even a more golden color. So I've got this pale off-white color and this pretty yellow golden color. That's a little too yellow, so I'm going to add a little bit of the cadmium red to it to orange it up a little. See, that's a pretty color. It's maybe a little more brilliant than the photograph, but that's okay. So, how do we start? I think I will start, I want to put in like a little bit of a tree trunk like I did in my sketch, but I do like that little tree in the back. I don't want to destroy it, so I will just do a hint of some trees back there. But right now, I'm going to start with this darker brown that I made and put it right in here. And it's going to go right up to the edge. And the really darkest one, I'm just going to add just a touch of that right there, so that it's really dark at that point. And maybe a little bit on this side. I'm going to switch to my other big filbert for the lighter values. It's nice not having to clean your brush between colors, so I'm just going to switch brushes. And I'm going to use this gold up here. Okay, and right now it's just kind of a mushy mess. It's not looking like anything specific. It's just kind of the background colors for my next step. I am going to kind of blend all that together. There's almost a little bit of gray, bluish gray in there too. Notice these subtle things back there. So that's the base for the brush. The brush has all these very, very fine grassy type look to it, and so I'm going to try to attempt to simulate that look using this darker brown, and it's coming kind of up from here. And that's why I made this slightly darker color, because if this wasn't dark enough, then I can go into this other dark color. Sometimes when the paint is wet, the paint will just disappear when you start to blend it, and so you need a slightly darker color so that it doesn't just go away. And you want it to look like it's going behind his head, so don't be afraid to take it right up to his little face. And you want probably some more of that on this side. And don't make it identical to the other side. Well, at this point, if I do want to put some of those trees, I'm going to do that now. So I've got a tree in this sketch up here. And I do like the tree over here, but any of these little trees will work. So maybe I'll just, and he's kind of looking in that direction, it'll help a little bit of interest for this composition. And keep in mind that trees usually don't go up and down straight. They tend to lean a little. And this tree's kind of far away. It doesn't have to be very big. It is still kind of far away. You don't want it to be too sharp. This is kind of a muggy, overcast day. And so that looks a little sharp to me, but let's see if I can maybe another branch. There. That gives it like a middle ground. So now that I've got that tree in there, I will add my final details to the brush in the background. And I want to do that with my stipple brush. This is a stipple brush, and it's very stiff, and it makes little tiny dots when you pounce. And so that will give me these beautiful little textures of the whatever that is on the brush that gives it the texture. The top is got these interesting layers. So I will be adding that lighter value also. This helps just give it some depth. I'm going to continue that color over here so it is cohesive and it blends. Okay, I'm going to go to the lighter value now. Sometimes you got to practice, you know, to see, make sure that the dots are the right size, that you didn't overload the brush. So you want to do that on your palette or near the painting, not on the painting. And just try to get an idea of how this plant grows. It's got these little tentacles. I want to get that impression of, but you don't want it to be the center of interest again. You want the kitty to be. So this is just a secondary interest. Now I may find once I do the cat that it's not dark enough or not light enough, and then I'll have to adjust it. I also want to put this light color down here. And you can see how some of the color that was on my brush is kind of blending in with the color I had before. And that's okay. I'm going to block in this area below him too. And that color is just a little bit more pink than the brush color, so I'm adding a little bit of alizarin crimson to it and putting that here. And I think I can go a little lighter, so a little bit more white. Okay, switch over to my dark brush and use a little bit of darkness down here. I lost some of my stems here. I want to get a couple of them back. I have this beautiful blue that I used in the trees, and I just want to put some of that down here. Just give it some depth when I start adding my other textures. Once again, I want to soften this up before I add the rest of the texture. Blend a little, but don't let it get out of hand, and keep some of it crisp and bright. Speaking of bright, maybe I can add just a little bit of bright to some of that color in the background. I'm thinking it needs a little more orange. That'll help get some color. Now, you see the original photograph maybe not have as brilliant of an orange in it, but I think that looks nice. I want to adjust the color for that shadow down here. It's a little more purple. I'm just using some of the same purples and blues that I was using for some of the trees above there. And shadows are always soft and fuzzy unless it's an intense bright light. And I just don't think this light is bright enough to be that intense. So once again, maybe even my fan brush can do this better. It's a big fan brush. I'll soften it too much. So we can go back in, bring it back. Make sure you keep the edges soft and out of focus. When it's a very smooth like this, this is kind of hard to, sometimes the paint starts lifting up instead of moving around, and there's actually a little bit of that warm tone in that shadow, and I'm getting into details that I should not worry about yet. Alright, so I'm going to go back up to this, and I'm going to need my liner. I always like to start from the base and lift. Now, when I took my brush, this is a trick on getting lines. When you put your brush in the paint, you kind of put it in the paint and twist and pull. And I call that sharpening the brush. You twist and pull, and if there's too much paint on it, then you just push it next to the paint and twist and pull. And then when you come up, you're going to find a very, very, very sharp point. Now, this is a very new brush. Sometimes these brushes, they get a little bit frayed, and if you can't do a really fine point, it's time to get a new brush. But you can use that other brush for other things. Alright, so now I'm going to do these lines. Try to make them random and organic. You don't want them to all be the same height and the same width apart. Don't make any two things the same. Just look at the photo, you'll find hints as to the pattern that grass makes. And sometimes once you get it, you can just do it without having to look at the picture anymore. But the photo will really give you some hints on making that grass look good. Try not to make little dots at the end of the grass. I get a lot of... If you're having a hard time using this liner, practice on a separate piece of paper or something, or on your palette. Sometimes I can get some very fine lines. I'm going to add a little more white to this and do some in front of this darker area, a little shadow area, and I'll give it a little more depth. Alright, and I want to do some more on the other side. I'm going to take some of this gold color that I used up there and do some grass down here. That way it doesn't have to all be the same color. Some of it's going up, some of it's coming down. I don't like having just a single color anywhere. I want lots of different colors just to give it some interest and depth. Okay, I still have some of this purple on my brush, and I think it'll be nice to have some of the shadows peeking in from, happens to be another cheetah and a tree, but you won't know that in this painting what that shadow is. And you see my cheetah is starting to get fuzzy and out of focus because the background is imposing upon him, but that's okay, we'll find him a little bit later when we start painting on him. There's a little bit of lighter color down there. And once again, those can be softened up if they're a little too harsh. And there's, before I'm done with that background, there are a few other little dark branches and lines I want to put in there. So let's try those dark lines first. So there's like these sticks on the ground. And there's sticks growing up. I'm not sure if I want to do it exactly like the picture, but maybe going up to give it some interest. And on this side, maybe a little bit heavier one. Maybe a tree that's trying to grow in this heat and desert of Africa. That's what's neat about each painting, has kind of a little story behind it. I can only imagine the heat. Looks hot anyway. Okay, well, there's actually a few more light values to highlight that go on top of those. But you could get carried away with the background easily, and really, I believe our center of interest is this beautiful little cat, big cat actually. I'm going to add a little bit darker one over here to be more consistent. There, now it kind of looks, both sides of him are from the same area. They're just, one's a little bit darker than the other. And I said I would do some splatter. If you'd like it to wait till it's dry before doing the splatter, then it's easier to erase. But I'm going to be brave and add some splatter right now. So I need my stipple brush. I usually, with the other paint, I would mix it with water, but since we have turpentine or turpenoid, I mix the paint with a little bit of turpentine, and I test it on the paper to see if it's good, and it looks like the dots are a good size. I can also test it up here, and that looks good too. So I'm going for it. I'm going to do a little bit of splatter on here, and what that does is give just the tiniest little dots. I'm going to add several other colors. I'm going to go for a lighter value, and maybe that pretty purple, maybe that orange, I don't know. I like to have 2 or 3 colors. There we go. And that just gives it a feeling of lots of little random dots. I'm going to add some darker dots. I like that orange I had up there. I'm going to add a little bit of orange. It's a lot of orange, but you know what? I kind of like it. So that's not going to bother me. A bit of that light bluish purple color is nice for down here. Oh, a little too much. So now I can show you how, if I don't like it, what to do. You see how I did this beautiful splotch right there? That's a little too much. So I can go in and undo it real easily. And anything else that is too much, I don't need to completely paint it out, but I can just soften up and use that for texture. And because I haven't worked on the cat yet, who cares if I get it all over the cat? That's going to disappear. The color of this road isn't exactly perfect. I think this is a little bit nicer. There we go. And so wherever I want it really bright, I can go back in and brighten it up a bit. And I can always splatter on top of that later. And soften up that again. And there might even be some even lighter spots on this. I'm thinking that this background is almost done. That went by pretty quickly. Okay, we're close to taking a break in between the background and the foreground. At this point, I'm just adding a little bit here and a little bit there. And I can play with this all day because it's very fun. But I am going to take a break now, and we'll come back to it and start on the cheetah. Here we are. We're ready to start painting again, and I'm going to start on the cheetah, but first I wanted to talk to you about the paint and saving it like overnight or for longer periods. I have, this is called a palette seal, and mine is kind of beat up, but it is wonderful for keeping my palette in. And then I take my palette, after I seal it, I put it in the freezer. You can also keep it in a refrigerator, and that keeps my paints fresher for months, literally, and I don't waste paint, and it's a lot more economical. So this, like, it's $15, on sale probably. Also, when you're using turpentine, after you've used it, it's pretty dirty. But after it sits overnight, it settles to the bottom, and the paint in the turpentine separates. Sometimes when it's warmer, it takes longer to separate, but don't throw away your old dirty turpentine. Basically, you get out another empty jar, and you take your turpentine that has separated and just pour it off until the gook is still at the bottom of the old jar. And you wipe that off, and next time you sit down and paint, you transfer that turpentine to this jar. And you never have to throw out any turpentine. When working on an animal or even a person, this particular animal happens to have spots. Some animals have stripes, and other animals have just variations of color on their fur. But you can't start off with the spots because they're on the top surface. What you have to do is pretend the animal doesn't have any markings at all, and just go for the the light and dark, where the shadows are and where the light is hitting the animal first. Once you have his form and values correct, then you can start going in and doing all the little fine dots. The dots are going to be one of the last things I do. What I'm going to focus on is his volume, or hers. I'm not sure if this is male or female. I'm thinking it might be a girl. Anyway, I do want to establish where the prominent features are, so I may do a little more detail around the face before I go into the dots. So anyway, so I'm looking at these areas. When I start mixing my first colors, I'm looking for this color, this color, this color, all the different varieties of color underneath the spots in the shadows, and I'm going to mix a variety of colors. Now, some of the colors that I'm going to use are going to be the same colors I used in the background. The cheetah is the color of his environment for a reason, and he's going to be very camouflaged. Good luck. You know, I want my painting, I want him to stand out in the picture a little more than he does in the photograph. I want him to stand out in my painting better. So that's what I'm going to focus on, is trying to make sure he pops forward and you can see him clearly. So I'm going to start mixing the colors that I don't have right now. I'm going to start off with some of the lighter colors, and when you are mixing a lighter color, you start off with a light color like white or yellow. In this instance, I'm using white, and I'm going to add a little bit to the white to try to come up with this very pale color under his chin. If you started off with a dark color and then added to that to try to get it lighter, you'll end up with a lot more paint than you need. So that's the rule, is if you need a dark color, start off with a dark color and add to it. If you need a light color, start off with a light color and add to that. I ask myself, where is this cooler or warmer? And it's cooler, and I need to add a little bit of warmth. Some of this beautiful gold color that I used before is very close to it, so I'm going to add a little bit of that to the white. And I believe it's just a variety of yellow ochre and some other colors. And I look at this, it's a little warmer. Maybe a tiny bit of cadmium red will help warm that up. And I mean a tiny bit, just the littlest dot will warm that up. If that's not enough, you can add another little dot until you get closer to the color that you want. We're getting really close. I am just going to add the tiniest bit of the alizarin crimson because I almost see a tinge of pink in there. And I may have gone too far, but let's see. That's perfect. I really do like that color. Okay, so that's one of my lighter colors. Let's make one of the darker colors down here. Now, because his body's kind of, her body, whatever, is kind of in shadow, some of these shadowy colors are cooler, kind of on a pale purple. I always see purple in everything, so I'm seeing a lot of purples in here. But there's still some warm colors, very close to this, but a little bit darker. So, how do I do that? I'm going to take a little bit of that color that I just made, and I'm going to kind of cool it down a little bit. Maybe I'll add a little tiny bit of ultramarine blue to it, and because blues are so prominent, you don't need much, and I mean, I just added the tiniest little dot to it, and it needs to be a little darker, so I'm going to add a little bit more, and I can see how it needs to be a little warmer too. So now I have kind of a blue color, but it's a little too cool. So I'm going to add a little bit of alizarin crimson to that color, and thus the purple that I thought I saw. Now I believe this is too purple. So I'm going to add a little bit of yellow to that to warm it up and to make it a little more neutral. So I'm going to add the yellow medium to it. It's a warm yellow, and it will counteract the purple and make it more on the gray side. And I don't know if it's exactly the color I was aiming at, but it is the color up here that I like. So I'm going to save that and keep playing with it. Whenever you accidentally make a color you like, go ahead and keep that. And then keep trying for that original color you were looking for. Well, I like this color. I'm not sure if it's the one I was aiming at. Once again, I can use it for some of the other areas. And these colors are very subtle. They're very similar. To the other colors that I mixed, but they're slightly warmer or slightly cooler. Now if you can't remember opposite colors, just remember if it's a warm color, you want to add a cool color to it. And if it's a cool color, you want to add a warm color to it. So I like this color for the background behind the dots here, for the lighter area. So I'm now going to try for some of the real darker areas. Now I made some dark paint for in the distance, and I can use some of that still. I have some blacks and browns that I made before, so I can still use those for some of the darkest dark areas. But there's some really subtle colors in here that are actually similar to these colors that I've already painted. So I'm going to start with a color that I mixed last time, and I used this in the background, and I'm going to see if that's close enough. And I think there's one more color that's just a little darker than that. This is the really dark color that I mixed yesterday, and you might, that's some of these dark colors have a little bit of warmth in them. This is not as dark, it's not pure black yet. I like this color, I'm going to use this color, but I need to make a real dark black for some of for the dots eventually when I get to the dots. So my real dark black starts with the Prussian blue, or the phthalo blue if you have one of the other, and the alizarin crimson, which makes that very dark purple. And I'm going to add a little bit of yellow ochre to that, which will dull the purple down. Alright, now I'm talking. Now we have a very dark black. And that, I'm probably not going to use this in the beginning, except for maybe around the eyes or face or something. But this will be close to the colors for the final dots on there. I'm going to save that. All that. Sometimes I spent more time getting the colors ready and mixing them before I actually get to paint. But it's important to be ready, and you will find that there are some colors that you didn't mix beforehand, so you'll just have to mix them as you're painting. I'm going to start with a small enough brush, And I don't see a number on this brush because it's rubbed off, but you can see it's not the tiniest brush. This is my tiniest brush, and I can get into the details with that, but I'm gonna be blocking in the head and body first, and I'm looking at what's under the dots. I'm gonna start underneath his chin with this first color I was mixing. Her chin. I keep calling him him, but I think it's a her. And it looks like it's a little lighter up here, but I won't know until I put the darker color in. Blocking his little nose. I'm finding myself leaning forward a little, so I need to get closer to. You want to make sure that you always have good posture when you're painting. So either bring the painting to you or get closer to the painting. But if you're leaning and your posture isn't straight up and down, you're going to find your back is going to be way too sore at the end of the day and the next day. Posture is very important with miniaturists. So when I have a color on my brush, I will, I'll start off thinking I'm going to paint in one area, and then I see that color in other areas, and I will just, if it's on my brush, I can go ahead and move that brush around. And remember, this is your first layer. You're going to keep playing with this until you're going to add other colors to it. Now you can see I've painted over the detail on his face, but it's still showing through. So don't worry about losing your drawing completely. You'll probably see it if you're not painting too thick. You'll see it through the paint, and you can find it again if you can't see it. If you drew it once, you can draw it again. So this is a very similar color down here, and might as well just block it in, and I can always adjust it later. Okay, where was that paint I was using? Is this it? This looks like I picked up a little darker paint, so wherever I see dark. And everybody has a different order that they like to work in, or a different area they like to start in. As long as you're starting from the farthest away, getting closer, it doesn't matter. You just have to think in layers. Switch to a little bit lighter paint to block in some areas that are not as dark as where I was. I just noticed this little area here should be part of the background, so I'm going to kind of block in that to make it be part of the background. If I'm not painting a drastically different color, I don't always bother to clean my brush in between paint colors. I can just wipe it off. If I get my paints really way different, then I will clean off my brush. Also, if you find you accidentally made a slightly different color than you wanted, and you just put a little bit of that color in a few other places, and it will look like you did that on purpose. So as you see, I will be adjusting the background a little as I move on. Also, I'm going to kind of switch over with a little bit of a dark color for this background, and I'm using a different brush now. And I do that a lot. If I find that I'm kind of switching back and forth between different colors, I'll have 2 or 3 brushes, one with a light color, one with a dark color. That way I don't have to be cleaning the brush all the time. And your turpentine doesn't get dirty as fast either. I tend to carry quite a few brushes in my hand, and sometimes that will get your hand to cramp up. So if you're noticing you're not using a bunch of those brushes, put them down. And you have to ask yourself why I see a certain edge. Is it lighter or darker than the background? Since I want this animal to really pop, I may exaggerate some of the darknesses. Now here I've just added a little bit of dark to a previous area, and I'm going to blend it with this little brush here so that I don't have a big line there. Now I love taking a little brush that is no longer useful for detail. It's kind of splayed and it's old and it's worn and it's soft, and I can just blend the wet paint into the wet paint and make it a nice gradation from one color to the next. And then I can see that edge of him a little better. In the picture you can actually see this edge a little better, so I can make some of this background just a little bit lighter. But I do like the details that I put in there. I don't want to get rid of them completely. The background should always be out of focus, a little bit soft, because otherwise you're going to draw attention too much away from your foreground, your center of interest. And sometimes you can blend with the brush you're painting with. I tend to kind of go back and forth between painting and blending. Now if this brush seems too big to add some of these details, then it's time to switch over to a smaller brush. But I like to start with as big a brush as I can, because then I'm forced to not really mess with all the tiny little details right away. But this is a pretty tight spot. And when I really start putting in my darkest darks, that's when we'll start to see this little face take shape. Right now we're just doing an underpainting for when we're getting ready to do those fine details. Now I noticed up here the shape of her head, and I have a little gap in here from the background. I didn't go far enough or close enough to the head, so I gotta fill that in, and that'll help define the head as well. So you can really see the top of the head better than you can in the photo. There's a spot on the side of his head that's almost pure white. And I don't usually use a pure white. I like to have some color in it, but I think that'll help make it really pop. So, plus I have a dirty brush, so it's not going to be pure white anyway, but it's going to be pretty close. There's a little bit of dried paint there I don't like. I'm going to use my special little tool. This is an old pen, dip pen, and it is really handy for coming in and taking out little chunks of paint I don't like. It's also nice for scraping and scratching when I need it. Okay. There's a little highlight here. And when you see these in the photograph, they're kind of subtle, but you can take these little highlights and emphasize them and make them even a higher contrast than you see them, and that will help this cheetah stand out better in this painting than it does in the photograph. So I'm kind of jumping back and forth between highlights and the base. Alright, I want to put in this pretty color in here. I love this peach tone on the chest. A little bit of that kind of blends into this area. And as you see, the colors are blending right on the canvas. So it's amazing. You think you got the whole background, and then I just noticed this area needs to be done. Not paying much attention. So you can see how if you don't quite get the background done, you can always go back in later and adjust it like this. Luckily I still have a lot of that color. Using this purple color for the shadows, and make sure that it matches the shadow you put in before, and that it all goes together as if it's going behind. And it's a good thing I noticed this before I finished it. And I'm not worried about the texture of the fur yet. I'm just kind of getting in the basic outline. This foot is a little bit in shadow, and I'm putting a little bit of cooler tone on it than I am on these little highlights over here. And as you see, they're not very defined. I'm just kind of marking it. The tip of the tail is somewhere around here, and I'll probably brighten that up. So if it's not perfect the very first time you put down a color, that's okay. Just keep a note that you need to adjust that. I like this kind of little bit of blue, cool color. It's a little bit warmer up here. There's actually quite a bit of warmth, and I know it's a little early to fuss with it, but I'm going to add. That's just going to inspire me. That little bit of cadmium red there. I love that warmth. Pretty, pretty, pretty. And do I see any of that somewhere else? Maybe a little bit in here. I'm always looking for those little touches. I love this part where I get rid of the raw canvas or the raw board or whatever I'm working on. I love not seeing any of the original surface. It just makes me feel closer to being finished. You see how since I've pre-mixed all my colors, I don't have to, I can just paint at this point. I don't have to spend the whole time figuring out and you know, pausing to have to mix that color. I've already got almost all the colors I need on my palette, and I can now just glory in the fun part. And this particular one is really easy to get caught up in details, and putting in some of my darker areas. Oh, there's one space that's still showing some of the original surface, and that's the eyes, because the eyes are so important. I definitely want to get out my smallest brushes for that. I'm not quite ready yet. I'm just trying to figure out where the dark areas, the shadow areas are. And block those in. I'm going back and forth between lights and darks. And I can do that because I have these brushes that one has the darks on it and one has the lights on it, and I can just switch hands and I don't have to spend a lot of time cleaning my brush so that I am not contaminating my paint. I'm just using the brush that works for that area. So at this point you're just kind of looking at the picture, your reference material, and seeing what is different from what you've done so far, and you start to refine all the little things that you've started. You start off kind of generally, and then you get down to specifics. I think I'm done with this bigger brush. I have a little bit of paint on it. And since it is so large, it's time to maybe switch to a smaller one. Almost. I still have a few little things I want to do. I like this gray for this area. Let's put some shadow. You see how faster this goes when you have a bigger brush, so I want to make sure that I really don't need it before switching over. Alright, I can always go back and grab this brush again if I find I need it. I think I'm going to grab a smaller brush for some of these highlights. I'm going to grab another one of my 20-aught liners so I can get into the nitty-gritty with some of the lighter areas. I like to moisten my brush with the medium before dipping it into the paint for the first time. It helps get in there. So where exactly? How about this pale blue? And I can go back and forth with my dark. The wonderful thing about oils is if you don't like what you just did, just do it again. Do it better next time. Unlike watercolors, or you pretty much have to live with that. If you don't like it, you're going to have to learn to like it. Oils, you just erase it and just go right on top of it. Very forgiving. And you have to be careful not to overdo it and to overwork it. Sometimes if you overwork it, you'll get some mud. The detail kind of gets destroyed if you play with it too long. Right here is a nice tight spot on his leg. My little cheetah is kind of looking like a cougar. A cat without spots. I'll bring out the cheetah later. Pretty little yellow orange area here. I just added some cadmium yellow medium. Maybe that's a little too yellow, so I'm going to add like a little color here with my brush instead of my palette knife. A little bit. It's probably too bright, so I'm going to add a little bit of white to that. I just think that color brings, there's a little bit down here as well, that color brings some interest up close to the face. A little bit of that here, a little bit of that there. Now if you accidentally do a little bit brighter than you want, that's not a problem. You just put a different color into it and kind of blend it away. You may not want to blend it all the way. Maybe you like that really bright colors. Everybody's got their own way of expressing. Sometimes you need that intense color. I'm trying to keep it on the natural side. Try not to make mud. And if mud happens, you just add some nice, pretty, brilliant colors towards the end. This brush is just a blender brush. I'm just kind of softening up some of these brush strokes. And when I say blender brush, it's one of those beat up old brushes that can no longer paint the details, but you can move paint around really nicely. Another way of drawing attention, getting your eye to focus where you want it to, is contrast. Well, people naturally are drawn to faces, so the eyes are going to be what they naturally look at first. But the fact that they're a very dark, have a dark rim on them, and they're next to fairly light areas, that's a nice contrast, and it also will draw the eyes. So when we're done, hopefully your eye will just go right to the face of this cheetah. We're not there yet, but when we get there, that's going to be really important, is that intense expression. I don't like finishing one area completely and then trying to go on to the next area and finishing that. I like to kind of, start to bring it all into focus a little bit at a time. I'm using my bigger brush just for blending here, so not just for painting. There's not a real hard edge there. You want to make sure that transitions are soft and subtle. Oh, I feel like I'm petting this giant kitty with little tiny brush strokes. I'm finding myself feeling big affection for this animal. So pretty. There is a subtle shadow right in here. And I think you're getting the gist of this. I'm just kind of slowly bringing it into focus and defining each one of the areas. Round shape of the tail, highlights on the top of the tail. The lighting is always important in a picture. You want to know what direction the light is coming from at all times. So if you add something in, you want to make sure that it follows the law of physics and light goes in the right directions. And we have good reference materials. If you've been drawing a while and painting a while, you kind of have a better idea of how light works and how shadows work, and you can kind of fake it a little bit better if you've have the experience. But when you're first starting, lighting can be very tricky, and if you're trying to make it up or change it in a big way, it doesn't always work. Something feels funny about it. There's some subtle kind of cool colors in this tail. You want to make sure that if you put a color in that you haven't put anywhere else, that you do put it somewhere else, even if it only looks like that one area has that color. Key is observation. Look at your reference. But when you're working from photos, those details are very clear and they hold still much better, and you can see what makes this tail look round. There's a shadow on one side and there's the light on the other. I'm very tempted to add some of the spots at this time on his tail, just because then I can really see if I've achieved the look I'm after. Now keep in mind, when spots are seen from different angles, they're not always totally little round dots. They're little dashes and oblong shapes as well. So don't do little polka dots when you get to that point. Look carefully at how there's each one of those little spots is a slightly different shape than the one next to it, and they're slightly different distance from the others, and they start to go from smaller to larger, and there's a pattern. You just got to pay attention to the pattern and not just randomly put dots everywhere. That'll really make it look amateurish. Oh, I notice I don't have a shadow on the tail. That will also make it look more round, is giving it a shadow. There's a lot of blues in the tail. Not the actual color of the tail, but the color of the shadows. This tail is kind of in the shadow of the cheetah. Alright, and here is the shadow of the tail. And in fact it's a little darker and a little warmer than that, so it gets closer to this. And the shadows should always be soft and out of focus. The edges should not be very sharp. And there's always exceptions to that rule. It depends on the lighting, of course. I'm going to start defining that face a little bit more. I think I've got the basics. And I might adjust the background a bit to make his head stand out, her head. In fact, I'm going to do that first. I kind of want this to come down a little bit further. Okay, that also might help define his ears, her ears a bit. You have to be careful about when you're doing a background around the subject that you don't like give it a halo effect. You want it to still look like it's going behind them. All right. This is the scary part, is getting into the face. That's the most important part of the whole painting. So you want to make sure that you're accurate and that it looks like this particular cat, or at least a cheetah. Maybe not this cheetah. I hope it looks like this cheetah. But so those eyes are an incredible orange. I'm going to start with the cadmium yellow, and I know it's really, really bright. Cadmium yellow medium, and add a little bit of cadmium red to it, starting off with a color that's probably brighter than it is, because I'm going to go in and define the eye with the darker brown. And of course these eyes are so small that it's really hard to get a lot of definition. Even though you don't see it so much in the photograph, I want to have a little bit of this color in both eyes. That'll just help it look right in the painting. You have to have the finest brush for this particular moment. And then you blend the two. Now, I'm going to switch to an even smaller brush. This is like a spotter. I think it's a spotter. It says spotter on it, and it says 10-aught. And it's a very, very tiny brush. Without any paint, and it's totally dry, I can use this as a blender brush and blend the two colors together to make a smooth transition. And I lost it completely. Let's try that again. There, so it's going from a bright gold to a kind of a pretty orangish brown. Okay, since I am very brave, I can add the pupil and the highlights to it while it's wet. But like I said, if you want to wait and let it dry first, that's okay. make sure that you're getting the finest brush you have that can go to the finest point. And put the little highlight right there, and there's one on this one too. And even the highlight needs to be softened just a bit with the brush. It's really easy to blend it into oblivion and have no highlight whatsoever, like I just did. I'm a little bit nervous about adding any pupil at this point because I want to make sure that the pupil's in the right spot by putting in the outline of the eyes. And I'm taking my darkest dark, or you can even take it the slightly reddish dark brown on your very finest point and define the outside edges of the eye. And make sure you're sharpening that brush and make sure it's nice and pointy. Trying to keep that eye round. My outline is a little thick right now, but I'm going to show you how to adjust that in a second. Let me do this other eye. He's got like a little eyelash here. I think I could have brought that gold in a little bit more. And if you're having a hard time going in one direction over the other, like sometimes I can go right to left easily, but I can't go left to right easily, then the trick is to do it upside down. And you can just look at the shape and figure it out this way. If one direction is hard to go on. I'm happy with what I did, but if I was having trouble, I don't have a problem taking the whole painting and turning it upside down in order to draw that line a little easier. Alright, so I'm going to define the outside of this eye better, and since all that paint is fairly wet already, I'm going to take this dry brush and just kind of move from the light paint into the dark paint and kind of trim it. That was easy. Then you dry your brush off again, adjust that shape. Now I can put in my pupil, and like I said, you might decide that you want to wait for that pupil, wait till it dries. I'm going to attempt it wet. I'm going to also adjust the shape of this eye first. There. And if it's a little too red, you just blend it away. Sometimes I will go over an eyeball, 5 or 6, 7 times before I'm really happy with it. Trying to get that glow and that feeling of wet eyeballs. Alright, let's see if I can add that pupil without destroying the eyes altogether. But if I do, I can just show you how I rebuilt it again. You'll see that the little pupil is really close to the top line up here. Right. Well, okay. Didn't like that so much, but I can adjust it. Going with some of the other colors, trim it a bit. I want to get that like concentration look, not the silly look. So I keep on adjusting the lights and darks teeny bit at a time until I'm happier with that. It's good enough for now. I'll come back to it later. But that'll help, I may see what is bugging me about that eyeball after I don't look at it for a little while. So I'm going to work on the shapes around the eyes, and that also might help. How about finishing up this marking on the face? It comes down here. Sometimes if I am looking too much at this larger picture, I will paint things larger in here. I have to keep referring to my scale photograph, the one that is the size I want, in order to make it the size I want, because it can get easily too big, and then I'll have to redo it. Here comes the nose. And step back and see if that's close. You're looking at all the different relationships, how far away this is from the nose, the little measurements. I'm seeing that my eye, the space around the eye needs to be shorter, or the dark around the eye is too big, so I'm going to use another color to lighten that up and to reshape it a bit. Another problem miniaturists have is dust and lint. Happens to the best of us. It gets stuck in your painting, especially oil painting, and a lot of miniaturists really like their work to be extremely smooth. It really drives me nuts when I see a piece in there, and sometimes you don't even see it until after it's done and dry. All of a sudden there's this lint there, and so I will have some tweezers or that little pen I used earlier to get rid of it if I have a piece that's kind of in my way. There's a little hints of this blue-gray all over the place, so I am just adding that in right now. There's even a little bit right next to the eye here. Well, this is starting to look good. This is where the focal point is, so I'm going to exaggerate some of the lighting a little right here, because that's where I want the eye to go to. And I'll probably spend more time on the face than on any other part, because that is the focal point, and that's where I want the eyes to go, and that's where everything has to be perfect. This is kind of that very pale purple color, which is probably actually white, but because it's on the shadow side of the face, it's not going to be white, it's going to be just a purplish color. And I need to make some of these colors a little darker so that this stands out. I'm looking at the face, and seems to me her chin is a little large. I need to adjust this chin here. But first I'm going to bring this down and make sure. Maybe I just need to bring her lips down, and then I can see if I'm right or wrong. So I don't want to use a really, really dark color for his lips, her lips. I haven't decided, he or she. Okay. So I'm going to a slightly lighter gray color and defining the lips a bit. So coming down from that nose and over. And at the moment it doesn't look like this particular cheetah, but I'm working on it. A lot of pushing and a lot of pulling. Now in the photo you don't see the lips as clearly as this, and I will adjust it so you don't see it so much in mine as well. But right now I want to see it enough to figure out if that's where I want them, and I can readjust things. Okay. Since I have this color on, it will go nicely in several other places. So I'm using what I have on my brush to define this kitty face some more. At this point, I can take my dry, tiny blender brush and adjust and kind of push and pull the paint to make the lips a little bit more fine and closer to what I'm seeing in the photo. And asking myself, does this still look like the photo? And not that it's important for it to look exactly like the photo, but it is important for it to look like a cheetah. And I'm not sure the chin is correct. It might need to be trimmed a little bit. So I'm going to bring the chin up a bit. And it's very subtle. It's just a fraction of an inch, just enough to define it. You don't want to leave a line around anything, so blend in. If you're working in the background, blend it in so it doesn't look like a line. It's okay to have an edge around things, but don't put a line around anything or it just won't work. So does that little chin look a little better now? And there's probably a variety of chins in the cheetah world. If you're not careful, you're not going to get this cheetah's right. Oh, also, there's this little patch. It's actually kind of on that red side. Right down here. And it looks like it's a little striped area, but actually there's some whiskers in front of this. So this is a solid dark space, and then later we'll put the whiskers on top of it. So this little spot there really says, I'm a cheetah. Little eyebrows up here also will help. This one you don't see as much, but it's there, so just make a very thin line. I didn't want it to go right to the eyeball, so I'm going to soften that up. This is a little more pointed than it looks. Now this brush doesn't have any paint on it, it's just a plain brush, and I'm using it to adjust these fine points. Whatever doesn't look like the picture, I'm adjusting it to make it look like the picture. And there is a beautiful line coming right down the middle of his forehead. And because his head is a little bit turned, it's not the middle of his whole face. It's actually a little off-centered. There's like a little triangle coming from the top of this line, right there. Gotta be careful about using the darkest dark on some of these. This is kind of the reddish brown, dark color. If you use the black, you may actually get too dark. Now, you can't see it in the little picture, but in the big picture I can see kind of a shape to this nose. It's a little bit more defined, and there's like a little, it's reddish. And so if I use the red, or even this kind of orangish color that I used in the eyes, that might be good, lighter enough. It has to be just a little lighter than the black you used to define the nose and the nostrils. So there, it's a little tinge of reddish brown. Now I also, since I have this color on, I'm looking around to see if I can use that in different areas. That kind of reddish brown. is down here too. You see I go all over the place. I'm not always sticking to one exact location. Okay, what else? Oh, there's kind of a little bit lighter orange color on his face right there. It's very similar to the eye color, to the darker eye color, maybe a little more red. But I still want this to be a little red. There we go. Just added that kind of pretty red to it, but I need to blend it out. I'm a little scared. Okay. So what I was talking about was right here. It's probably a little dark, but just take a little bit of my blender brush and just play with it a little, and it lightens up. There's some of that in here. So you can see I'm slowly building up this face. I put the little brush strokes in the direction of the fur, and it looks like fur. And I imagine this head is not as smooth as it looks in the picture. My guess is it's a little fuzzy. So I just soften that up a little. Some bright color right there on his forehead. Kind of a yellowish. Now the top of his head is in full sunshine, and right in front of him is not. There's still some darker areas on the face that I'm not quite happy with, so I'm going to, they're not going to be black, more this gray. And some of this area is just a little darker than I got it. There's like a brilliant yellow near his forehead here, between his eyes. So I'm going to use an even more yellow, cadmium yellow. Almost right from the pure color, but it doesn't look that yellow because it's mixing in with this paint. Well, I'm liking it, I think. Maybe just adding some of those little spots there will help. Be careful not to use your darkest color again on these spots, because it's already pretty light and they don't need to be that dark for them to show up. There's like a little dark spot on his ear, one there. Once again, they're not polka dots. They are, some of them are just little slashes, little flat oval shapes. Might be adding just a little more texture, because this is getting close to the finished, what the finished face is going to look like. And if you see that you've lost definition, then go back in and bring it out again. Looking cute. Maybe the background needs to be a little darker again. Remember, if you touch one spot, you gotta kind of adjust the rest of the spots around them and blend. So when you're doing a landscape and you mess up, it still looks like a tree or a mountain. But when you mess up on an animal, it's a lot more obvious even the tiniest little difference can make it feel funny. Something's wrong. You may not know what exactly it is. You just know something's wrong. And so you keep adjusting until it feels better. Separating the chin from the body with just a little bit of a light gray color, putting that area deeper into shadow. It's not exactly that way in the photo, but I do think they need to be separated a bit. And if they have to be separated by color or temperature, I think that helps stand out some more. Alright, let's finish some of the, if there are any spots on the face to be finished. I think there's a couple of little spots on the cheeks here. But to figure out, there's like 2 lines of spots, and I don't want to go that dark. I'm going to start the tip of this little shape, comes up, and then it starts curving down. These few little dots need to be in a pretty precise location. But again, nobody's going to look at this photo later. They won't know that my dots are a little big, unless they're a very big cheetah expert. Then these dots start coming down the face and the neck. Define that ear a little more. There's a nice little glow inside the ear. It might be close to that gold color. There's a lot of that here and there. The ears are translucent, so it's nice to give them a feeling like there's a little bit of light shining through the thin ears. I'm adjusting this back area a little. I wanted the shape to be a little more organic. Also, I wanted the shape here to be different from the other side. One of the rules of composition to make your painting interesting is to never make 2 of the same thing. I don't want this to be the same as this. And so I just kind of offset it a little to make it more interesting. And in the process, I kind of lost some of the little details on the bushes in the background. So I'm going to bring some of those out. I also want to redefine the stripe on his eye. Didn't like where it was, so I'm putting it a little higher. Right there. Now, people ask me if I paint with a single hair, and so my husband made me a brush that is a single cat whisker, and I don't even know if you can even see it. Now the alternative is to get one of these brushes that used to be like this and now hardly has any hairs on it. I think it has 1 or 2 teeny little hairs, and that you might be able to control better than my crazy long-haired one. But let me attempt at least 1 whisker using my single hair brush. And the advantage of this really long one is if you start at the tip, you can kind of control the curve of it, although that didn't do very well. Let's see if I can do the next one better. Kind of put the tip down and then And that kind of curved a little bit better. And I can take my other brushes and adjust anything I don't like. I can't tell in this picture that it has whiskers on the other side, but most cats do, so I'm guessing that it does. So I'm going to add a whisker or two onto this side. So easy to make them too heavy, but that looks not too bad. That looks very nice. I like that. Thank you, Bill, for making me this little single hair brush. And at the moment he is not selling them, so I can't. But if you know anyone that knows how to tie flies for fishing, that's how he's got the skills to make this little brush, by tying flies. He kind of tied, I think he drilled a hole or cut it in half. I don't know what he did. He glued it in there. I'm sure if you emailed him, email me and I'll forward it to him. He'll tell you the secrets of making a single hair brush. Now he's got a cheetah with a finished head and the rest of his body has no spots. Let's start adding some more of these spots. First of all, you have to ask yourself, are all these spots exactly the same color? Now they probably are. The local color is probably exactly the same color, but sometimes you get reflective colors, and so some of them in the shadows might have a little more blue or purple, might be a little lighter than some that are like facing you, some that are coming from a different direction. I think the front legs and have a nice distinct pattern, so we can start there. And I am using some of the darkest darks, and if it's too dark I can always blend. So look for the little patterns. Here's a couple of dots going together here. Didn't look like my darkest dark, did it? It's because it blended into that wet paint, and I think that's why some people are nervous about painting wet on wet, because it doesn't seem to be working sometimes. So the reason for that is you're just not painting with thick enough paint. So if it's not going on and it's kind of blending as you're painting, you are either pressing down too hard or your paint isn't thick enough. So load that brush up and don't be afraid to add thicker paint, especially towards the end when there's a lot of wet going on. And if you're not sure where the dots go, just keep looking at that reference photo. That'll give you some good ideas on how to put those dots in. I certainly have not memorized cheetah spots. And if they're not perfect little dots, that's okay. They don't have to be. No one will know. No one's going to compare this to your reference photo. Just keep in mind, don't do polka dots. Don't do all the same evenly distributed, perfectly round spots. These are all oblong shapes. And they're on fur, so they're supposed to have a little bit of maybe texture, kind of rugged edges a little. They're not perfect. The ones on the edges are going to be longer and skinnier because they're wrapping around, and the ones facing you are going to be the most oblong and round ovals, and easily adjusted with your blender brush. Just go right in with that little tiny brush and make it the shape you want it. Some of these might be a little on the red side instead of the black side, as in a brown instead of black. Alright, let's do the other leg. You may find while you're doing this that what you're doing it on is not the right exact color that you think that you wanted it to be. Like I am noticing I would like a little more highlight on the edge of this leg. So just go in and fix it. Ah, nice. Right in here needs a little more definition. There's some fur. I want to make this furrier. So here's where the brush strokes are going to show. Now if your brush strokes are not showing, you just need to make the paint a little lighter or darker than what you're painting on, and then maybe it will show a little better. I don't want to get rid of some of this beautiful peach color though, so I'm going to emphasize that a little. Pretty peach color. Some cheetah expert is going to tell me that they're never that yellow. And I'm saying the light is making them look like that, and so you can't tell me what does not look like this particular cheetah on this particular day. There's a little bit of warm brown in here. And I'm not blending so much anymore because I do like to see like little furs and hairs. I'm using this to emphasize the fur. Okay, any other places? Down here a little bit. Sometimes I will have gone over the same spot 3 or 4 times using slightly different colors, so it tends to be layers and layers of different colors kind of shining through, and that's what starts giving it really some nice interest. It's a little too dark, you just soften it up, blend it away. Okay, anything else with that brown? Adding just little strokes, enough to get the impression of fur. Really get this area bright. That's what is going to really stand out, this white. If your white is blending away into oblivion, just get a pure white and kind of float it on the top. And if your brush is dirty, it won't make it pure, will it? So you gotta go back in with a clean brush. Pure white out of the tube. I hardly ever do pure white out of the tube. And it won't be because there's already wet paint underneath, so it will blend into that naturally. But I really need a nice bright contrast. Someday artists in the future may actually get to paint with light. But right now I just have this pigment out of a tube to work with. There's actually a little area in here that's kind of in shadow that is not bright. Next to that white, it will really make the white stand out. So I'm doing this kind of a pale purple gray color in here in the shadow area to emphasize my contrast. Ooh, I like that pale purple in there. It just looks really pretty. And I think there's some of that here and here. It's good to get this in there before you put the spots in, because it's really hard to put it in there after the spots. Alright. Ready for more spots? This is way fun. Okay, more spots on the next leg. Okay, just make sure your paint is thick enough to actually float on top of this wet layer. Redefine, reshape. Some are a little bigger, some are smaller. Just have to keep looking at them, defining them. one thing you got to be careful of is thinking you know what it looks like. And just painting from memory and not really looking back at your reference very often. Because guess what? Your memory isn't that good. Unless you're one of those rare people that actually has a photographic memory, but most of us do not. I certainly don't. And so I need to continually check my reference. Spots, spots, more spots. And anyone who buys my videos, I hope you will feel free to email me with any questions you might have that I haven't answered in these. I want to make sure that I'm helping out the students who are just learning how to do this. And even if you've been doing it for a while, you might even have a few questions about miniatures in particular. And I'm trying to keep this nice open white space white. So just follow the pattern. Now it doesn't matter if you don't have exactly the same amount of spots, as long as they look reasonable. I don't believe anyone will be counting. You also have to sometimes look at the negative space, or the shapes between the objects. So my hand would be a positive shape and the negative shape would be like the air between my fingers. So if you look carefully at the spacing between each one of these spots, that will help you also, because the blank spots are just as important as the ones that have spots on them. You're not done till all the spots are there. Still have a little ways to go. I think the biggest spots are on the legs, it looks like. There's one that's right there. So if you see a real prominent spot, you want to maybe put the main character in the location where you know it to be, and then paint those spots nearby it. Mine aren't exactly like the pictures, but that's okay. They're close enough, I think. I might look at them later and wish I was even more precise, but I think I'm doing okay. We're getting closer. Now we just have the body. Let's start with these under here. I know where those are. The photographer who took these photos is Vicky Tam, and she was generous enough to let me use them to paint from. She had spent some time in Africa helping out with a group that was rehabilitating cheetah cubs to go back into the wild. And these were the cubs. Look like pretty big cubs, huh? So all these leftover spots in the middle kind of are going in a pattern of stripes, but not exactly. They're not really super stripy. But I can see, like right here, they do kind of have a striped pattern here. Just be careful not to make polka dots. This is the part I think will most likely look like polka dots. They were so close. Oh, well, I hope I was able to teach you a little bit about how to paint from wildlife, in particular this amazing cheetah. Like I said, if you have any questions or if I didn't cover something, feel free to email me with those questions. And if there's something that you want me to paint in a video in the future, send your suggestions to microangelo@earthlink.net. Remember how we did the splatter in the background? I'm going to use a little bit of this reddish brown color and practice over here. Never use just one color. So I'm going to go in with another color, a little lighter. And this is going to just give it a feeling of dirty and outdoors. Maybe a little of that purple blue color. And any of the spots that I don't like there's one on him right there. There's one right here. Just soften it up and get rid of it. You notice there's a couple of little sticks lying on the ground. You can add straw and other interesting details here and there. And just look at your picture and see if there's anything there that'll help you out with giving it some atmosphere. When I'm ready, when this is dry, I will sign it with a permanent ink pen because I've never been able to sign my name with a brush this small. And then after it's dry for probably a couple of weeks before it'll be actually dry. It'll feel dry to the touch in a day or two, but you want it to wait a little longer than that to do the final varnish on it. And I put a coat of Kmart varnish, and it's kind of a glossy varnish. And I do like that. And I want to soften up these sticks a little. I don't want anything that is too distracting. I want these to be a little out of focus. A little bit lighter areas. It'll help this look like it's got some really bright sunshine happening. Of course, the camera always gives you a little bit higher contrast than your eye actually sees. Your eyes can see a lot more than the camera lens, so the camera tends to be darker or lighter than we see. We see all the other little values in between. So if your photograph has an area that's so dark that you can't see into the shadow, just put something there anyway, because believe me, in your natural vision you probably can see that pretty clearly. Just the camera can't pick it up. Okay, I'm going to call it done now, I think. Famous last words. If I add one or two specks of it later, that's not going to be a big deal, but I like it. Alright, so I'm done with the painting. I still haven't varnished it or signed it or anything, and it's still very wet. But I can at least show you what it's going to look like in the frame. I don't want to get too close because it is wet, but that's what the final project will look like. To finish this off, when this is dry and varnished and ready, you put it into the frame, and on the back you put another piece of heavy acid-free paper right behind the painting, the same size as the painting. And then the last thing you do is take a piece of paper and cut it the size of the frame all the way out to the edge. So you put down a little dab of glue. So in fact, the back of the frame, the last piece of paper that you're going to glue to the frame, is what's holding your painting in the frame. You should never glue your painting into the frame. It's going to sit in there like it does in a regular full-size frame, and it's kind of floating inside. And that way, in the future, if something happens to the frame, your painting doesn't have glue all over it, and you can reframe it into a different frame. I hope you had fun. Bye-bye.